So Baldur's Gate 3, well, not technically Baldur's Gate 3, but kind of Baldur's Gate 3, you'll see why here momentarily, is getting an HBO TV series. This is not something I thought I would ever be saying. At the most, I thought maybe like an animated series on the Companions or something would come out, but an HBO TV series is in production. And of course, I have covered the crap out of Baldur's Gate 3 for the past 5-6 years now. So I'm going to talk about it. I got some thoughts. Let's go over what we know, starting with the article that revealed everything here. And that is from Deadline.com. Breaking Hollywood news since 2006. Got to get your daily dose of Hollywood news, right? So, the title of this article is Baldur's Gate TV series continuing game's story in works at HBO from The Last of Us co-creator Craig Mazin and Hasbro Entertainment. So, Craig Mazin, I guess most recently known for The Last of Us TV series, but he also did Chernobyl and Mythic Quest, I think it was called. All three of these shows, numbers-wise, have been successful. The Last of Us, I think, set some records on HBO, and Chernobyl is widely regarded as a very, very good show. The Last of Us reputation is hit or miss, especially when you get to season 2, but numbers-wise, the show did heavy numbers, and Craig has so far been successful. Even Mythic Quest, I think that show was and ended up being canceled at like season 5 or something like that, but it was still successful. So regardless of how you feel about Craig because of The Last of Us, he's a pretty big name in the TV series, movie, film industry right now. To clarify, for those of you guys that don't know who Hasbro is, they're a gigantic corporation. They own a bunch of IPs, and they own the Dungeons and Dragons IP. And they own Wizards of the Coast. And Wizards of the Coast is the company that handles the D&D IP. So, although Hasbro and Wizards don't own Larian Studios, who made Baldur's Gate 3, they own that IP, and they have control over it from here on out. Larian has no control over what happens with anything in the Forgotten Realms, what happens with the Companions. They only had control over the game they made, and now they have moved on to Divinity. HBO is developing Baldur's Gate, so it's not going to be called Baldur's Gate 3, it's just going to be called Baldur's Gate, a drama series based on Wizards of the Coast video game franchise, with Mazin attached to create, write, executive produce, and showrun the TV adaptation. So Mazin is the big guy here. Also executive producing are Jacqueline Lesko, and Jacqueline was involved with The Last of Us, been in the film industry for a while, and Cecile O'Connor, who did Jurassic World Dominion, who was part of Jurassic World Dominion, The Fall Guys 2024, and also The Last of Us as well. So Mazin is working with a few people that he worked with recently with The Last of Us. And then Hasbro Entertainment's Gabriel Morano. Of course, Hasbro is going to be kind of like the overlords, I would assume, with where HBO is allowed to go with this series. Now, Chris Perkins, this is actually pretty interesting. Chris Perkins has a really good reputation in Dungeons & Dragons. He is the former longtime head of story at Hasbro, wrote a lot of D&D, books, the adventure modules, and I think some of maybe the rules books too. I'm not entirely sure, but he is actually working as a consultant on this game, which I would actually say is a pretty good thing. I like Chris from everything I've seen on him. He's very knowledgeable on D&D and the lore and all that. So this is actually one good thing here. If you're really feeling kind of dread at this news, like nothing's good's gonna come out of this, Chris being somewhat part of it as a consultant, I would say is actually some good news here. We'll continue on with the article here momentarily, but interestingly enough, over on X, Deadline, of course, posted, their article link and a little passage here about the news. But then Larian's director of publishing commented, "Very good journalism. Oh, by the way, you never asked the creators of Baldur's Gate 3 about this, but don't worry. It's cool." Now, I do just want to say that because he says you think that maybe that's directed at Deadline. It doesn't say Craig or Wizards. He says you under a Deadline post. So there could be misinterpretation going on here, but the way that most people are taking this, including myself, is that Hasbro, Wizards, HBO, they never actually told Larian that they were considering doing this, and Larian was in the dark until the news dropped. So Larian kind of learned when we learned about this. And although Hasbro and HBO, they are certainly in the right to do that, like they can do that, it's their IP now. Larian doesn't control anything Baldur's Gate 3, where it goes from here on out. It's just kind of weird. It's like, you think you would consult the actual company that made this name so big. Without Larian, there would be no show in development. That's for damn sure. Larian is 99% responsible for why Baldur's Gate 3 is popular. Wizards plays a little bit of role because they set some of the foundation of lore and all that Larian was able to work off of and work off of that Baldur's Gate name. But if this is true, if Wizards didn't consult Larian or even tell Larian about this, it just kind of makes you wonder what the relationship is like and what's really going on here. It just doesn't seem like the right thing to do. Now, with that said, if we go under the owner of Larian's account here, Sven Vinka, he did a post, and we'll talk about this post here in a moment, but if we look under the replies, you can see that Sven replied to somebody who said, Sven, are any Larian writers consulting on the show? He said, not to my knowledge, but Craig did reach out to ask if he could come over to the studio to speak with us. From the conversation we had, I think he is truly a big fan, which gives me hope. So Sven is a little bit more optimistic about this than it seems like most others, which is perfectly fine. I think he probably is excited, and I would actually be excited if I worked at Larian too, knowing that my game was so good that they want to make an HBO series on it right now. And even if it kind of falls and it fails or whatever, it's still going to get a ton of free marketing, and more people will probably be checking out the game because they know the name Baldur's Gate now. But now it's confirmed that Craig at the very least did reach out to Larian, whether it's before or after the news got out that it seemed like nobody even talked to Larian about this. Craig did reach out, and Sven seems to think that he is actually a big fan of Baldur's Gate 3. It seems very likely, though, that Hasbro or Wizards, the owners of this IP, the ones that benefited off of Larian's success, did not contact Larian at all. There might be a little bit of a weird relationship going on there. And I think most people probably fall onto Larian's side of, wanting to support Larian over Hasbro and Wizards and thinking that Larian probably are the ones in the right, and any reason for any shaky relationship is most likely due to Hasbro or Wizards with some shady business practices and all their greed and all of that. But who knows, though? This is where we're at right now. But continuing on with the article, unlike HBO's The Last of Us, which retold the story from the PlayStation games, the Baldur's Gate TV series will be a continuation to the games, telling a story that takes place immediately after the events of Baldur's Gate 3, as the characters old and new are dealing with the ramifications of the events in the third game. So they do say games here. I mean, of course, because Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 take place before Baldur's Gate 3 does in the lore timeline. Baldur's Gate 3 is about a century after, but I think most of this show, if it ends up actually, fully going through production and happening, is going to be a little bit more focused on Baldur's Gate 3, of course, because that is where the huge mainstream success comes from. Those are the companions that a lot of people are attached to, Astarion, Shadowheart, and all their stories. So I would assume that, fans from OG Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 probably not going to get a ton of love in the show, which is probably actually good news for a lot of OG Baldur's Gate fans. They probably don't want HBO to touch, any themes or characters from those games. But this is most likely going to be heavily focused on Baldur's Gate 3, the continuation of where that story ended in those characters. It just makes sense. Now, it's certainly interesting to think about where would they go with the story, especially considering that it seems like they want it to be so closely connected to Baldur's Gate 3 and its characters. Well, there's two main endings to Baldur's Gate 3. I guess you could say there's a third one if you self-destruct as Gale. But there's two main endings, and of course there's so many other endings depending on what you do with individual characters, companions, Orpheus, the Emperor, etc. But the two main endings are, I would say, the good ending where you defeat the Netherbrain and put an end to the Dead Three's plans, and the Absolute is no more, ultimately saving the city, even though it's in kind of like a half apocalyptic state. If you do that ending, the city seems like it's going to be rebuilding at the end of the game. They separate the ending of Baldur's Gate 3 with the start of the TV series, with a few years, although the article did use the word immediately after. There could be like this new beginnings story where a new plot forms. I guess you could make that work. And then also we have the evil ending, of course, where the player character or the Dark Urge, depending on what they do with that, dominates the Netherbrain and becomes the Absolute, and the city of Baldur's Gate is now a space alien octopus city with murder and all sorts of bad stuff going on. That'd be a really cool intro, in my opinion, to the Baldur's Gate TV series, but I doubt that they would go that direction. Vast majority of players play good in RPGs, so if you're going to have a canonical ending, you're probably going to go more so with a neutral to good one, rather than erase what players, did in the game, but maybe they don't care. Also, got to consider the evil ending results in the companions being enslaved, basically. So I guess that could be part of the story arc, but a few things that we read in the article here make it seem like I doubt that they will be enslaved and dominated by the absolute. Never know, though. But what do you do with the companions? I don't know. There's a lot of different endings for their stories, and they've already gone through these huge story arcs. Granted, a lot of people feel like Will needed more and Karlach needed more in her story. But at large, they already went through these huge story arcs, and now they're just going to have another huge story arc. Like, how are they going to make that work? And if they do, really focus in on the companions, fans of Baldur's Gate 3 are going to be very serious about them making the right choices with the companions. And is there even a right choice? I don't know. So this might be a recipe for disaster. Now, with that said, I do think that the companions would serve much better as cameos or very, very side characters. And you know what? They actually do kind of talk about this a little bit in the article. The TV series will feature both existing characters from BG3 and new ones. It is expected to keep the D&D tradition of taking new characters who are not that powerful and follow their journey through adventures that make them powerful. The new protagonists are bound to run into beloved characters from Baldur's Gate 3, some of them heroes, some of them villains, some of them literally devils. Raphael confirmed. Who occupy the same world. Now incredibly powerful, they will meddle, helping or hindering the new heroes. So I do think this is a much better route to go than actually focusing on a story of the companion, specifically like a day in the life of Astarion or Shadowheart. So this seems like as of right now, it's going to be a new cast of characters that run into the companions. And in my opinion, the more on the side that they keep those companions, the better off they are in terms of fans receiving them well, having that excitement of actually seeing the character but not overdoing it. And if they do it that way, the less they have to get into individual canon stories for these characters, which players are going to have different feelings on what they think should be canon. Not to mention, how do you do sexuality for these characters? If this is going to be a show that has some sex appeal and romance and stuff, are you going to show the companions? If they have a big focus on companions, are they going to have sexualities? Because BG3, I think the goal was player sexual, maybe with the exception of Astarion. You're just going to all of a sudden establish sexualities for the characters. I think you're going to be in some dicey territory for that. But the more you keep them on the side, the less you have to do that. Then, of course, we have that question of how much does HBO really truly care about these companions and Wizards of the Coast? Like, how much do they really care about being faithful to their characters and who they are? Apparently, Craig is a huge fan of Baldur's Gate 3, and Sven did say that he thought he was a huge fan, so I guess I'm leaning on him being a fan of Baldur's Gate 3. He actually says in this article, they have a quote, "After putting nearly 1,000 hours into the incredible world of Baldur's Gate 3, it is a dream come true to be able to continue the story that Larian and Wizards of the Coast created. I am a devoted fan of D&D in the brilliant way that Sven Vinka and his gifted team adapted it. I can't wait to help bring Baldur's Gate and all of its incredible characters to life with as much respect and love as we can. I'm deeply grateful to Gabe Morano and his team at Hasbro for entrusting me with this incredibly important property." So this is, it's good to hear. I don't know if I believe this, to be honest with you, that he put 1,000 hours into Baldur's Gate 3. I'm not going to say it's a lie, but I'm leaning towards that not being true. Kind of feeling a little bit like an Elon Musk Path of Exile 2 situation here. Like a guy like that who's running all these huge TV shows is just playing Baldur's Gate for 1,000 hours. He has a family, a wife. I read that he has kids, that they might be grown up now, but still it just doesn't seem likely, right? I guess it could be. So there might be a little bit of hyperbole going on here. With that said, I feel a little bit better knowing that Sven said that he felt like Craig was actually, or Craig, yeah, Craig, right? Craig Mazin? Craig is an actual fan. At least Sven felt that way. So I'm going to lean on this guy actually being a fan of Baldur's Gate 3. But, how far is that actually going to go with this huge, very expensive production? But speaking of budget, you would think that this would be an insanely expensive show. Unless they're going to bring in some sort of AI or something. That would be, oh man, imagine if it was generative AI show. But I don't know how they can do a show that really represents Baldur's Gate, this huge high fantasy universe with all these crazy magic spells and everything. It seems like it's going to be a very, very high budget show, like something, like Lord of the Rings or something like that. I don't know though. It just seems like, are they really going to get a good enough budget to make this look the way that we want it to look? Maybe there's new technology that will make it a lot more possible, but Last of Us was a very high budget show. So maybe they do have the money here to attempt this, or maybe there's some technological advancements that we're just not fully aware of in TV yet that they're going to be utilizing. But it's a little bit scary to think about, because it's like this, to really make this good, I feel like you have to spend a shit ton of money. And then to end the article, I just want to touch on this statement right here. HBO's Baldur's Gate is designed to coexist alongside the Forgotten Realms live-action D&D series. Hasbro Entertainment is set up at Netflix with Sean Levy producing. So I did hear about this Forgotten Realms live-action thing, but I haven't heard from it in a while. It seems like that is still in production with Netflix, and it's going to coexist with this Baldur's Gate series. Who knows like how far they are in the process? It seems like very, very, very early on with the Baldur's Gate one, at least. We don't have much more information on this, but let's go ahead and see what some people are saying. Specifically, Sven, the owner of Larian Studios. Crazy that a story that started out in a small hotel conference room eventually evolved into a narrative inspiring enough for it to become an HBO series. So yeah, if you work at Larian or if you're Sven, it's got to be pretty crazy to hear that HBO wants to actually do a high budget TV series, you know, basically based on the game that you made. That's pretty incredible. Regardless of how it turns out, just the concept of this has got to be crazy as a game designer to, you know, hear that. We worked incredibly hard making Baldur's Gate 3 worthy of its legacy. Its characters and narratives are the result of many teams working together, and I think I can speak for them all in saying that they'll think this is cool and hope that what comes next will enjoy the same level of passion. So like I mentioned, I do think from Larian's perspective, it's really cool that this has happened. Like Larian was just a small little niche studio in the CRPG genre, and now look at what they've become. It's pretty crazy. The endings of Baldur's Gate 3 were created so that they could serve as narrative soil for new adventures. There's plenty of directions they could go. I'm eager to find out which ones Craig and his team will pick. He's reached out for a chat, so we'll have the opportunity to tell him our thoughts. Crossing fingers that the story we're cooking up for Divinity will eventually grow to the same heights, certainly putting in the hours. The cool thing is if Divinity was ever made a TV show, Larian owns the Divinity IP, so they would be the overlords over who is allowed to make a show and where they go, the show, the characters and all that. I'm sure Larian's writers would be heavily involved with that. They're not involved at all right now with Baldur's Gate 3, or with Baldur's Gate, the TV series, which is kind of, I don't know how that's going to work, but for Divinity, that'd be pretty cool. So my overall thoughts, I guess I could say, is I did give my opinion throughout this entire video, but I would say I want to be 50-50, as in I'm waiting to see more and I'm excited. I'm leaning more towards the pessimistic side right now. I think it's up to Hasbro and Craig and HBO to pull me back up to 50-50, or maybe even in an optimistic direction. But naturally, I'm a little bit more on the pessimistic side of this actually being what it should be and getting the love that it deserves. It's kind of weird knowing that Hasbro and Wizards supposedly haven't talked to Larian at all, and only Craig, I'm assuming recently Craig reached out to talk to Larian, but Hasbro and Wizards haven't talked to Larian at all. Like I said, there's probably a little bit of a shaky relationship in there somewhere, but if you truly cared about this show being good and representing Larian's work, because they're riding off of Larian's success here, you would still consult Larian. You would get over your ego or whatever shaky relationship you have and talk to Sven and the writers and really try to make this good, which may be happening with Craig right now, but it's a little weird. You know, I kind of think that Hasbro and Wizards are really just trying to ride Larian's success here, and they're going to try to ride that success, but it's going to be the dip in the roller coaster. Even if HBO and Wizards have good writers that can help continue on the story of some of these characters, you're trying to work off of previously successful writers' work with likely not the best communication ever. Maybe there won't be hardly any communication between Larian's writers. Craig just might have a quick chat with Sven, and that's it. That seems to be a little bit of a recipe for disaster these days. Even if you have good writers, it's just like you're a whole entirely different writing crew taking over previously successful characters that were successful because of those writers, not to mention because of those actors and voice actors, etc. In BG3, a lot of the voice actors did mocap, and a lot of them are actual actors too, but I doubt that all of them will be able to be actors for the actual film. Even appearance-wise, a lot of them won't necessarily be able to fit their character, even if they have the acting skills. So do they change up some of the voices? Does Astaria not have Neil Newbon's voice? I don't know. This does not seem like a territory that I would want to be in. I would rather just start something new, but they keep pushing in on Baldur's Gate 3 and the characters in this article for obvious reasons, because that is what was recently successful. But like I said, it might be a recipe for disaster. And I might not be feeling this way if they just didn't focus as much on Baldur's Gate 3 specifically in that article in Baldur's Gate 3 characters and continuing stories and stuff like that, even though we are going to have what appears to be a new cast of main characters focused a lot on Baldur's Gate 3 specific stuff. I think if they didn't do that, this show has a better chance of being successful, maybe just really small cameos, etc. That doesn't appear to be the case right now. So that makes me lean pessimistic. Also, just the fact that, you know, Baldur's Gate 3 is such a player-driven RPG. What are they going to go canonically with for some of this stuff? I think it's a very muddy, messy story to continue, especially with the companions. I think it's going to create a lot of controversy. At the end of the day, though, I guess it's possible to do this right, and things can be established as canon. It's not a big deal. It always happens with D&D stuff. An event happens later on. Wizards establishes what is canon, and the world goes on. But it's going to get very, very interesting, especially with specific companion stories, sexuality if they go down that route. I don't know. So I'm leaning on a little bit on the pessimistic side, but I'm trying to be in that 50-50 area to keep an open mind and report on this as unbiased as I possibly can. But I'd be lying if I didn't say that. As of right now, I think HBO and Wizards, kind of it's on them to prove to us versus us just being blindly hopeful that this is going to be written well and done well. I mean, like, it's not like Larian, like where we have trust in them. This is completely different. Very, very different. But congrats to Larian, as this is super cool for them to know that their game has inspired this HBO, I'm assuming, high budget TV show. That's pretty cool. I'll keep an eye on this and inform you guys of any news as it does relate to Baldur's Gate 3, which is a big topic on my channel. We'll see where we go from here. Seems like most people are not feeling too good about this after I just kind of surfed the internet a little bit, but I understand why. We shall see. Catch y'all in the next one.